It is July 25th, 1917. Canada has been at war for 3 years. Young Canadians are dying in the trenches of France and Belgium. The federal government is running out of money. Finance Minister Sir Thomas White rises in the House of Commons and introduces something Canada has never had before, a personal income tax. He calls it the Income War Tax Act. He frames it as a temporary measure to fund the war effort. His own words on the floor of Parliament: he hoped the tax would be reconsidered after the war. The war ended on November 11, 1918. The income tax never went away. Over 100 years later, the Income War Tax Act of 1917, 11 pages long, has become the Income Tax Act of 2025. Approximately 3,600 pages and over 1.1 million words. Canada's tax code grew from 6 pages in 1917 to over 1,400 pages by 2017. It has continued expanding every year since. And here is the number most Canadians have never added up. The Fraser Institute estimates the total tax burden on the average Canadian family, including income tax, payroll taxes, sales tax, property tax, carbon tax, gas tax, alcohol tax, tobacco tax, and all other levies, consumes between 40% and 45% of total household income. You earn $1. Half of it, by the time it passes through every layer of taxation, is gone. This video tells the complete story: where the income tax came from, how it expanded into a system of layered taxation that most Canadians never fully see, what the government does with it, and what it can do instead, and the question that economists, politicians, and citizens have debated for decades. If the government can create money, why does it need to take yours? Let's build the complete historical record, because understanding how income tax became permanent is essential to understanding every debate about taxation that followed. Before 1917, Canada had no personal income tax. For the first 50 years of Confederation, Canada's federal government funded itself primarily through customs duties, excise taxes on goods like tobacco and alcohol, and postal revenues. The average Canadian paid no direct tax on their earned income. The government's relationship with its citizens' wages was, by today's standards, almost entirely indirect. 1916. The corporation tax. As World War I dragged into its third year, the federal government introduced a corporation tax in 1916 to help fund the war effort. This was the first direct tax on profits in Canadian history. July 25, 1917. The Income War Tax Act. Days after Parliament voted to introduce conscription, sending Canadians to die in the war, Finance Minister Sir Thomas White introduced the personal income tax. The political logic was explicit. If young Canadians of modest means were being conscripted to fight, wealthier Canadians should be conscripted financially. White called it the conscription of wealth. The original 1917 tax was modest by today's standards. It applied only to individuals earning above $1,500 per year, a threshold that excluded most Canadians. The rates began at 4% and rose through a graduated scale. There were no capital gains taxes. The entire act was 11 pages. Finance Minister White hoped it would be a temporary tax, and so insisted it be called a war tax, so that once the war ended, it might be reconsidered. 1918. The war ends. The tax stays. The armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. The Income War Tax Act remained. Despite the new tax, the Canadian government ran up considerable debts during the war and was unable to forego income tax revenue after the war ended. The government had become structurally dependent on the revenue. The temporary emergency had created a permanent fiscal architecture. 1920. The sales tax arrives. 2 years after the war ended, the federal government added a sales tax. The income tax had not been repealed. Now it was joined by a consumption tax as well. 1948. The Permanent Income Tax Act. 3 decades after the war ended, the Income War Tax Act was finally replaced, not repealed, replaced. By 1948, the Income Tax War Act was replaced with an officially permanent alternative, and the Income Tax Act was established. The word war was removed from the name. The tax itself remained, now explicitly permanent. In 1943, the government introduced tax withholding from paychecks. Before this, Canadians paid their taxes directly and in full at year-end. After withholding, the money never reached the workers' hands. It was removed before the paycheck was issued. The psychological effect was profound. Taxes became invisible. You never had the money to give up. It was simply not there. The 2025 Income Tax Act. The Canadian Income Tax Act spans approximately 3,600 pages as of 2025, encompassing over 1.1 million words in its core provisions and regulations. This volume has expanded dramatically since its inception, growing from 6 pages in 1917 to over 1,400 pages by 2017. It has continued growing annually since. Action step. Look up the original 11-page Income War Tax Act of 1917. It is publicly available through the Library of Parliament. Reading it takes approximately 15 minutes. Understanding how a document that short became 3,600 pages over 100 years tells you everything about how tax systems evolve. Here is the mechanism most Canadians intuitively feel but have never had clearly mapped out for them. The term double taxation has a specific legal meaning, being taxed twice on the same income in 2 different jurisdictions. But in the colloquial sense most Canadians use, and the sense this video addresses, it refers to the reality that a single dollar of earned income is taxed at multiple points in its journey through the economy. Layer 1. Income tax. You earn $100 in gross salary. Federal and provincial income tax removes approximately 25% to 53%, depending on your income and province. At the national median income of $67,000 in Ontario, approximately 26% leaves as income tax before you see a dollar. Layer 2. Payroll taxes, CPP plus EI. Before the income tax even reaches your calculation, CPP and EI deductions remove approximately 7.58% of your earnings up to the maximums. At $67,000, CPP takes $3,867 and EI takes $1,078. These are not voluntary. They are mandatory before your employer issues your paycheck. Layer 3. Consumption tax, HST/GST. You receive your after-tax income. You go to a store. The remaining dollars are taxed again. 13% HST in Ontario on most goods and services. The dollars that survived income tax and payroll tax now lose another 13 cents of every dollar spent. Layer 4. Property tax. If you own a home, you pay property tax annually on an asset you purchased with after-tax dollars. The average Ontario homeowner pays approximately $4,500 to $5,500 per year in property tax. That property tax is paid with after-tax income, which was itself subject to income tax, payroll tax, and consumption tax. Layer 5. Carbon tax. Embedded in the price of gasoline, home heating fuel, and any product transported using fossil fuels, The carbon tax adds a further levy, currently approximately $95 per ton of CO2 in 2026. This cost is embedded in prices paid with after-tax dollars. Layer 6. Sin taxes and levies. Alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, each subject to additional excise duties on top of HST. These are paid with after-tax dollars on purchases already subject to consumption tax. The complete journey of $1. Start. $1 earned. After income tax, 26% effective rate at median income, approximately 74 cents. After payroll taxes, CPP plus EI, approximately 7.58%, approximately 68 cents. Spent at a store, HST 13%, approximately 60 cents of purchasing power. Buying a home, property tax, land transfer tax, further reduction. Buying gasoline, carbon tax plus gas tax, further reduction. By the time a median income Canadian's dollar has been fully cycled through the economy, the government has captured substantially more than half of its nominal value through layered taxation at different stages. The Fraser Institute's most recent annual Tax Freedom Day analysis estimates this total burden at 40% to 45% of total household income. That means the average Canadian works until approximately early June each year just to pay all taxes, before earning a dollar that is fully their own. Action step: track your own dollar. Take your gross salary. Subtract income tax, CPP, and EI to get your take-home. Then estimate your annual HST payments on spending. Add property tax if applicable. Add carbon and gas tax estimates. The total as a percentage of gross income is your personal total tax rate, almost certainly higher than you have ever calculated before. Here is the question that governments rarely answer directly, and that has generated significant debate among economists, particularly since 2020. The observable fact: during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Bank of Canada's balance sheet expanded dramatically. Through a program called quantitative easing, the Bank of Canada purchased government bonds, effectively creating new money electronically. Canada's money supply grew substantially. Government emergency benefit programs, CERB and others, were funded in part through this expansion of the money supply, rather than purely through tax revenue. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is publicly documented central bank policy. The Bank of Canada's balance sheet, which was approximately $120 billion before the pandemic, expanded to over $575 billion at its peak in 2021. According to Bank of Canada data, the mainstream economic explanation of why governments tax. Most economists across the political spectrum agree that taxation serves several functions beyond simply funding government spending. The mainstream view includes: first, managing inflation. If a government creates money without also removing money from circulation through taxation, it risks inflating the money supply, which reduces the purchasing power of every existing dollar. Taxation removes money from circulation, acting as a counterbalance to money creation. Second, resource allocation. Taxation transfers real resources, labor, materials, land, from private use to public use. Governments need roads built, hospitals staffed, and armies equipped. Taxation is the mechanism for redirecting productive capacity. Third, redistribution. Progressive taxation is explicitly designed to reduce wealth concentration. Funding transfers to lower-income households that moderate inequality. Modern monetary theory. The heterodox view. A school of economic thought called modern monetary theory, or MMT, argues that for governments that issue their own currency, taxation's primary purpose is not revenue collection, but inflation control. In the MMT framework, a government that issues its own currency, Canada, the US, the UK, but not Eurozone countries, which use a shared currency they do not individually control, does not need to collect taxes before it spends. It creates the money and spends it first. Taxes then reclaim some of that money from circulation, preventing excessive inflation. In the MMT view, taxes do not fund spending. Spending happens first. Taxes regulate the money supply afterward. The inflation evidence from 2021 to 2023. Canada's CPI peaked at 8.1% in June 2022, the highest in 40 years, following the pandemic money creation period. This is consistent with the mainstream view that money creation without corresponding taxation or production expansion generates inflation. The Bank of Canada then raised interest rates aggressively to remove stimulus from the economy, a contractionary policy that works in part through the same mechanism as taxation, reducing the money available to spend. What this means for the average Canadian: whether taxes fund government spending directly or manage inflation indirectly, the result for the average Canadian is the same. Approximately 40% to 45% of household income flows to government through various tax mechanisms. The philosophical debate about why this happens does not change the lived experience of earning $67,000 and keeping less than $50,000 of it. What it does change is how you think about the system and what questions you are entitled to ask your elected representatives about how that 40% to 45% is used. Here is the part of this video that presents the evidence honestly. Because the claim that taxes are designed to keep citizens from accumulating wealth is a serious charge that deserves serious examination. The argument that high taxation suppresses wealth accumulation. The Fraser Institute has documented that Canada's personal income tax is among the least competitive in the developed world. Canada now has one of the highest top PIT rates, and it kicks in at comparatively low levels of income for high-skilled workers, professionals, and entrepreneurs. Put simply, the worries of 1917 have been borne out. Personal income taxes are the tax area where, globally, Canada is least competitive. Ontario's top combined marginal rate reaches 53.53%, meaning above certain income thresholds, more than half of every additional dollar earned goes to government. This is not a fringe view. It is a measurement confirmed by KPMG's 2026 rate tables. The capital gains tax, which did not exist for the first 105 years of Canadian Confederation, now taxes investment returns. Canada now taxes capital gains, which, as Herbert Grubel and Jason Clemens point out, for the first 105 years of Confederation Ottawa did not do. Taxing capital gains directly reduces the incentive and capacity to accumulate investment assets over time. The structural argument: a tax system that takes 40% to 45% of total household income leaves 55% to 60% for living, saving, and investing. If cost of living consumes 50% to 55% of gross income, as it does for many median-income Canadians, the remaining margin for wealth building is almost zero. This is not a design flaw. It is an outcome that serves different interests depending on your perspective. The argument that taxes fund services that would otherwise cost more privately. The counter-argument is equally serious. Canada's health care system, publicly funded through taxation, saves the average Canadian household an estimated $15,000 to $20,000 per year compared to U.S.-style private insurance premiums and out-of-pocket costs. Public education, subsidized childcare, now down 30%, public transit infrastructure, roads, and social safety nets, are all funded through taxation. The question is not simply whether taxes take money, it is whether the services returned are worth the cost. A Canadian who pays $20,000 per year in total taxes but receives health care, education for their children, and roads may be getting reasonable value. A Canadian who pays the same $20,000 but does not use many public services directly may feel differently. The historical pattern, taxes expand, rarely contract. Contrary to popular mythology, the tax was not explicitly temporary. Rather, Finance Minister Sir Thomas White recommended only that it be reconsidered after the war. The income tax was not the only temporary measure that became permanent. The GST replaced the manufacturer's sales tax as a more visible and revenue-efficient consumption tax. The carbon tax was introduced, challenged, partially modified, and remains in various forms. The historical pattern is clear. Tax systems expand with new fiscal needs and are rarely substantially reduced once established. The honest summary: taxes do reduce the disposable income and wealth-building capacity of individuals. That is not a conspiracy. It is arithmetic. Whether the reduction is justified by the services returned is a value judgment that reasonable people reach differently. What is not debatable is that understanding exactly how much you pay, through how many channels, and for what stated purpose, is information every Canadian is entitled to have. Here is the most empowering section of this video. Because understanding the tax system is not just an intellectual exercise. It is the foundation for using every legal tool available to reduce your personal tax burden. The registered accounts are the government's own tax reduction tools. The TFSA, RRSP, and FHSA are not loopholes. They are government-designed incentives explicitly built into the tax code. Every dollar inside a TFSA grows completely tax-free. Every dollar contributed to an RRSP reduces your taxable income. Every FHSA contribution is deductible, and the qualifying withdrawal is tax-free. These accounts exist specifically to encourage saving, and they are available to every eligible Canadian. A Canadian who maximizes their TFSA, RRSP, and FHSA pays dramatically less tax over their lifetime than one who does not, using the exact mechanisms the government built into the code. The RRSP deduction at high marginal rates. At Ontario's 43.41% marginal rate on $100,000 income. An $18,000 RRSP contribution saves $7,814 in immediate tax. That $7,814 is money the government would otherwise have returned to you for saving. Over 30 years of RRSP contributions, the tax savings compound into hundreds of thousands of dollars. The dividend tax credit reduces the effective tax rate on eligible dividends. Eligible dividends from Canadian corporations are taxed at approximately 7.6% at $70,000 Ontario income, compared to 29.65% on employment income. The same dollar, in a different form of income, is taxed at a dramatically lower rate. Investors who understand this structure their income accordingly. The capital gains 50% inclusion. Capital gains are only 50% included in taxable income, meaning half of every investment gain is completely exempt. Inside a TFSA, even this 50% inclusion disappears. All gains are zero. The right to ask questions. Beyond personal tax strategy, the history of the income tax gives every Canadian the right to ask their elected representatives specific questions. Why has a temporary war measure expanded to 3,600 pages over 107 years? What is the optimal balance between taxation and money creation as monetary policy tools? Why are some forms of income taxed at dramatically different rates than others? What services are being delivered for the 40% to 45% of household income that flows to government annually? These are not radical questions. They are the questions any informed citizen of a democracy is entitled to ask. Action step. This week, complete 3 things. First, calculate your total annual tax payment across all layers. Second, open CRA My Account and check your TFSA and RRSP room. Use every dollar of it. Third, read Finance Minister White's original 1917 speech. It is publicly available. Understanding where the system started is the beginning of understanding where it should go. Let's come back to where we started. July 25, 1917. Finance Minister Sir Thomas White. The Income War Tax Act. 11 pages. A measure to fund a war. The war ended in 1918. The tax did not. In 1920, a sales tax was added. In 1943, withholding was introduced, making taxes invisible. In 1948, the word war was removed and the tax was made explicitly permanent. In 1972, capital gains were added, a tax that had not existed for the first 105 years of Canadian history. In 1991, the GST arrived. In 2019, the carbon tax. Today, the Income Tax Act is 3,600 pages and 1.1 million words. The total tax burden on the average Canadian family sits at 40% to 45% of total household income. You earn $1. Multiple layers of government, federal, provincial, and municipal, have mechanisms to capture a portion of it at each stage of its journey through the economy. Whether this system is justified by the services it funds, healthcare, education, infrastructure, social safety nets, is a value judgment every Canadian must make for themselves. The mainstream economic view holds that taxation serves essential functions, funding public services, managing inflation, and moderating inequality. Critics argue that Canada's tax burden has grown far beyond what was necessary, suppresses wealth accumulation, and has strayed irreversibly from its original purpose. What is not a matter of debate. The system is 107 years old, began as a temporary measure, and has never been meaningfully reduced. On the money printing question, yes, Canada as a currency-issuing nation has the technical capacity to create money rather than tax. The Bank of Canada demonstrated this during the pandemic. The reason most economists argue against funding government spending entirely through money creation is inflation, the erosion of purchasing power that hurts the lowest-income Canadians most severely. But the right balance between taxation and monetary policy is a legitimate debate that deserves more democratic participation than it receives. Here is what is entirely within your control. Every dollar you protect inside a TFSA is a dollar the 1917 income tax cannot reach. Every RRSP contribution recovers tax that did not have to be paid. Every FHSA contribution is deductible going in and tax-free coming out. The system was not designed for your benefit. The tools inside it were. Use them.